Welcome to Assistance League of St. Louis's 16th Annual Authors Brunch. I am Dawn Thomas, President of Assistance League of St. Louis, and I could not be more proud of our organization this year. We have been a vital part of the St. Louis community for over 33 years, and this year we continue to meet the ever-increasing needs of our most vulnerable citizens. We are an all-volunteer group of almost 500 members. Assistance League of St. Louis is part of a nationwide organization started in California to help after an earthquake in the Bay Area of San Francisco. The organization gathered momentum after the First World War and continued to expand across the United States. St. Louis started a chapter dedicated to transforming the lives of children and adults through community programs in the late 80s and has seen our community through some trying times. This year, we met one of our biggest challenges yet, but it couldn't stop our volunteers from doing what they do best, meeting the needs of the St. Louis community. We rolled up our sleeves, we planned, we Zoomed, and continued to safely volunteer. Our programs look different this year, but we were able to deliver bags full of items, curbside, to closed school children with everything they needed to learn efficiently. We put athletic shoes on the feet of children who desperately needed to get outside and to move around. We held virtual book festivals and socially distanced storybook character parades at several Head Start schools to encourage young readers. Our literacy program also participated in 3 Urban League drive-through food drives, where we safely gave away thousands of books to aspiring readers. Our outreach program fielded a record number of requests from desperate St. Louisans who had nowhere else to turn. They were able to provide household items, beds, hygiene kits, and numerous items needed to weather the growing pandemic. Rose continued to provide women and children in shelters with the items they needed to start a new, safer life away from abuse. My Own Fun Stuff made a quick pivot and now provides activity kits to homeless shelters and people who need comfort and distraction from the stress of poverty. Our volunteers have been creative, hardworking, and tireless, all while remaining kind and focused on our mission. Assistance League of St. Louis is still vital and still making a difference. One way we were able to make this all happen was due to the generosity of our donors. In a year of uncertainty, our faithful donors opened their hearts and gave to help us better the community they live in and love. If you were one of those donors, thank you from the bottom of my heart. Please enjoy this short video to get a better idea of who we are.
We have no pay people, we're non-for-profit, and we identify needs in the community that aren't already being met. And once we identify those needs, we develop a project to fill those needs. We will earn the funds to fill those needs, and we will do all the work ourselves.
Fantastic Finds has it all.
We are a step up. We are not just old things. We are young and beautiful things, too.
Fantastic Finds raises approximately $250,000 a year.
We bring them from the school, 60 kids on a bus, to our headquarters, and we actually dress them in the uniforms.
A lot of them are in public housing. They're in some pretty dire situations, so this is very helpful.
We take our time, make sure the child's clothing fits them. We're generous with the hugs.
It makes my heart feel good to see these smiles, how happy they are to get a toothbrush, a book, not to mention the clothes.
A lot of the students come with sizes that are at least 2 sizes too small. From their feet are just crunched in, or the sole isn't even on. We've had them come out with just the tops of shoes, and their socks are getting wet or cold, or they have no socks. We also give them 2 pairs of socks.
We have to take care of our children's social emotional needs first, and if they don't have those needs met, then they can't learn in the classroom.
If we weren't here to give these to them, they don't have another volunteer group to give shoes.
Imagine what it would feel like to flee your home with all your good stuff and then go to a drop-off point. The Assistance League helps us to keep women safe. If a woman comes in with nothing, okay, she starts to think, I probably should go back. I at least need to get this. The Assistance League, the pink bags, helps the woman to feel good about herself. They've got personal hygiene items in them, slippers and pajamas, but it's also what the women bring who bring the bags. They bring a smile. They bring an attitude of gratitude and of giving. And so the women get to see that as well.
The Assistance League Literacy Committee, we're called BFF, which means Books from Friends. Our whole mission is to promote literacy in the St. Louis community by providing books to aspiring readers.
This program is so helping us get our students where they need to be with their reading level by providing them with 2 books, as well as sitting down one-on-one with the volunteers and being able to read with them.
So a couple of years ago, we added a puppet show to our program, and so we one of our members wrote a story about the day the books went on strike, or the day the books quit, and what would happen to a school if they didn't have any books to read. And the kids also get to interact while we're doing it.
I'm Dr. Art McCoy, and I'm the Superintendent of Schools for Jennings School District. I want to take a few minutes to tell you about why the Assistance League is so vital to our community. They see us and our children for who we really are. They see the needs, they see the wants, the hopes, and the desires, and they see to it that those needs are met.
The benefit of our relationship with the Assistance League and St. Louis Public Schools is that students and families are provided needed essentials to encourage student attendance, promote high self-esteem, improve social development, as well as help to support a more positive teaching and learning environment in our classrooms.
Thank you for what you do. Thank you for giving back. Thank you for making a difference. And know that you are making a difference.
I would like to introduce you to this year's chair of Authors Brunch, Jill Grulich. This woman made pulling off a virtual event look effortless. Her kind heart showed in everything she accomplished to bring you today's event. Assistance League of St. Louis, 16th Annual Authors Brunch, Living with a Full Heart Chair, Jill Grulich.
Hello, everyone. I want to thank you for being here this morning. We were really hoping that this year would be normal, but even though we are doing this event virtually again, I hope that you will enjoy it and feel the author's heart as she speaks to us. Again, my name is Jill Grulich, and what an opportunity it has been for me to be the Authors Brunch Chair this year, along with my co-chair, Debbie McConnell. Thank you, Debbie, for all your help. I also want to thank all of our sponsors. It truly amazes me that even during a pandemic, our members continue to open their hearts to make this event a success. Many thanks to each and every one of you. You are so appreciated. It is my honor to introduce our 2021 Authors Brunch author, Allison Richmond. She is the international best-selling author of 7 novels, The Secret of Clouds being her latest. She graduated from Wesley College with a degree in art history and Japanese studies. She is the daughter of an abstract artist and an electrical engineer. Allison herself is an accomplished painter, and her novels combine her deep love of art, historical research, and travel. Her novels have been published in 30 countries and 25 different languages. One of her most well-known, The Lost Wife, is currently in development to be a major motion picture. She lives in Long Island, New York, with her husband and 2 children. I am so sorry that we can't meet with her in person, but being virtual with her will be the next best thing. So, at this time, let's meet Allison Richmond.
Thank you, Jill, for such a wonderful and warm-hearted introduction. I'm so appreciative to be invited here by the St. Louis Assistant League. I know that the League does incredible, important and philanthropic work in your community, so it's just a great honor to be here speaking and just learning more about your program and connecting with you, because I am excited to share my love of writing and learning with such a beautiful community. So I usually begin my talks by prefacing it and saying that my whole goal here this afternoon is to open my heart to you, to share not only what I do and how I do it, but really almost the soulful motivation behind every book that I write. As Jill mentioned in my introduction, I am the daughter of an abstract painter and an electrical engineer. And I usually mention that in my talks and even in my bio, because truly, I think my parents helped shape my mind to look at the world in a very specific and unique way. So my father, the engineer, from a very early age taught me that if you truly want to understand something, you need to be able to take apart all of the intricate pieces and put them back together again to understand how something works as a whole. So writing historical fiction, which is predominantly what I do, there are so many small little details that go into writing a novel that is historically accurate, emotionally authentic. You are truly creating a world in which the reader needs to step into, but because it's historical, you need to make sure everything is accurate. So one might not realize it, but an author must, research what a woman in the 1940s, how she would put food on her table. If there's a war going on, are there rations? How much flour, how much sugar, how much milk is she allowed for her family? What she's wearing, what are the fashions in 1940? Do people just start wearing trousers? Just start bobbing their hair? If you have a character who's walking down the street, and he glances at the newspaper headlines. What are the newspaper headlines on May 5th, 1938? These little details are so specific and need to be really well researched in order to make sure that the book has, value and substance, in the sense that you are actually learning through osmosis as you read a novel, and that the author has done their due diligence to make sure what you're reading is accurate. So I absolutely love the early parts of writing a novel, because I'm combing through text, I'm looking at photo archives, I'm learning about all different things about history, how long a woman was waiting online at the grocery store, if there was, was it from 9 to 3 in the afternoon, what would be on the shelves when she got there, all these little things to make a woman during that time period true and alive for you as a reader. My mother, though, the artist, I have such a special spot in my heart for my mother. She truly taught me to see the world in what I describe as an artistic lens. So from really the time I was 5 years old, my mother was telling me, look outside your window and look at how your window frame basically creates a frame for the cherry blossom tree outside your window. And look at how that tree changes in the winter when it has no leaves or no blossoms, and you can see the shape of the bough of the tree. And look at how it changes in springtime when the flowers bud and when the leaves turn green. And she truly, I speak of in the past tense, but both my parents luckily are alive. Both my mother truly believed that every season has its own specific palette of color, its own texture, and it should be appreciated, and that beauty is everywhere, and you just need to see it and pause and appreciate it. And that was nurtured very, very early on for me as a child. Also, my mother loved taking me to museums and telling me that when you looked at a painting, you walked up close to see how the artist had done their brushwork, but then you took several steps away to see how everything changed. When you did look at it from a few steps afar. The same thing with sculpture, that when you look at a piece of sculpture, you don't just look at it from one direction, you walk around the sculpture to see how something new is revealed in every different perspective. So the reason I share that with you is because when I'm writing, I actually hear my mother in my head telling me to change my perspective, to look at something from a different point of view, to think about what season we are in, and in the book, and to paint a scene for you where you can see the colors that the the characters are seeing outside their window, to appreciate the different textures, whether it's the snowflakes of winter or the cherry blossoms that are falling from the trees. And so that feeling of closing my eyes and seeing it first before I paint it with words for you really comes from the way I was taught to see the world at an early age. I think that's a little bit unique for how, as an author, you approach your writing, because I think a lot of writers, they have an idea, they have a plot, and then that steers them. But for me, when I sit down, every chapter is like this mini composition, and I don't work on an outline. I actually start seeing how it's unfolding, almost like a movie in my mind. And then sentence by sentence, it's like a brushstroke that I'm painting for you. And I'm also very conscious of how much description to use and how much description to sort of sometimes pause away from. So there's this delicate dance that I think comes also from my experience in painting. When you look at a blank canvas and you have to think about how you're going to trace the eye, what direction to go to, and where you're going to saturate it with color and description, because you cannot have a painting that is all color of the same intensity. There has to be these pockets of breath and light and white page in order for you to see what's really important in the direction of your eye. So I'm thinking about all these things, even though it's verbal and it's words and language. I'm thinking about darkness and light. When do you go dark in a story like The Lost Wife, which I'm going to just, transition to talk to you about? That's, when you're dealing with books that, or their themes are ones that are very dark sometimes, like a book that takes place in a Holocaust, there also needs to be these pockets of light, because life is like that, right? We all have times where there is tremendous sorrow and pain, but then we also have these beautiful moments where, there's this light that comes out and we can appreciate that. So we were just talking about that prior to, Jill and I and some of the others from the St. Louis Assistance League were talking about this year and how difficult it has been, but there are also these bright spots. And I was mentioning how it's the first time my children have had dinner with their father, who always had a very long commute. So as challenging as sometimes it was living on top of each other, there were these bright spots. And so as a novelist, when you're writing about periods of history, which are very dark and sometimes very oppressive to our heart and our psyche, it's also so important to see the good. And so that's my job, in order to pull you into the story, that you learn, that you can visualize everything, because truly I'm creating a world within those pages that begins from the first sentence to the last. And so you're stepping into that world and you have to be drawn to those characters. But I'm also showing you, hopefully, on a more spiritual level, these characters' lives are not that different in yours, in that there are periods of challenges, but there are also these exquisite periods of grace and beauty. So when I was talking with the coordinators for this, I said that sometimes people like to hear a little background about The Lost Wife, and then also my most recent book, The Secret of Clouds. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you 2 for the price of 1. And then in the Q&A, you can ask me about any of my books. I have written 7, but I'm going to specifically talk about those 2 today. The Lost Wife, the old cover, they just reissued it with a new cover. Is a novel that is extremely near and dear to my heart. The idea for The Lost Wife came after the birth of my second child, Charlotte, and my husband and I had just moved into a really lovely new home, but with a new mortgage and lots of expenses. My husband told me that he didn't think that we could really budget more than 1 day a week for my writing, because I needed a babysitter, because I had 2 children under the age of 3. I had an infant and a 2.5-year-old. And anyone who's had children knows that's not a good age for you to just be working at your desk and letting them crawl around the house unsupervised. So I remember being really, before we moved, I was writing, I had a babysitter twice a week, and I would work during those 2 days. But to know that I was only going to have 1 day to write really felt like a blow. And I've written my whole adult life. I had my first novel published in my mid-20s. So to feel that I was now going to have a real constraint on my creative time, was a disappointment to me and a challenge. But I did grow up with a family, where I was always told that no matter how difficult something might seem to you at that time, there were others who had always, had greater challenges, and you should be appreciative of what you had. And so I was sitting at my desk thinking, well, how am I going to write my next book? How am I going to have a creative life? And this question sort of just came into my mind, which was, historically, how did artists over time create, when they had great challenges? And more specifically, if an artist had everything physically taken away from them, could they still create? And my mind drifted sort of to the darkest period in history from my perspective, which was the Holocaust. And I thought to myself, well, during the Holocaust, if everything was stripped away from a creative person, did they still find a way to create? And I knew that I had read in the past about musicians who had smuggled in their violins and that were sometimes forced to play when the trains arrived in Auschwitz, some who were forced to play for Nazi officers in order to survive. But I had no knowledge of a visual artist who had somehow managed to work in the concentration camps. And so on that afternoon, just because I was curious and trying to sort of learn more and put my own life in perspective, in a healthy perspective, I Googled artists who created during the Holocaust. And what came up was a New York Times article about a Czech artist by the name of Dina Gottliebova, who was a young art student right around the time that the Nazis came to power. And she was first sent to a concentration camp called Theresienstadt. In my book, The Lost Wife, I call it Terezin, which is the Czech name for the concentration camp, but many people know it under the name Theresienstadt, which is the German name. And in Terezin, she was forced to do propaganda artwork for the Nazis in order to survive. But then the article detailed how when she was deported to Auschwitz, she, the day that she arrived, she saw someone that she knew from art school back in Prague, a man named Freddie Hirsch. And Freddie Hirsch approached her and said that he had gotten some stolen paint and that he wanted to know if she would do a mural in the children's barracks of Auschwitz. So at great risk to herself, she decides she's going to paint a mural of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs in the barracks, the children's barracks, because she, when she was an art student in Prague, had been so moved by the Disney film Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. It was the first big animated Disney film she had seen. She took off her star at great risk to herself 3 times and snuck into the cinema. And for those 2 hours that she watched the movie, in her oral history, I learned, she said that she felt that she was transported to another place. And so she wanted to give that to the children, that for the few seconds when they woke up in the morning, when they opened their eyes, they would see something that would try to transport them. So at great risk to herself, she paints this mural of Snow White against an alpine background, I think with a few dwarves, not knowing if she was going to be punished or even killed for that mural. And unbeknownst to her, Dr. Mengele was looking for an artist who could document the horrific studies he was doing on gypsies at the time. And so Dina was called into Mengele's office and said, if you make these watercolor studies for me, I will spare you your life, he said to her. And she responded quite boldly, my life is worth nothing unless you spare my mother's as well, because she had been deported with her mother at the time to Auschwitz. So the article went on to say how she actually survived Auschwitz, her mother too, because of this barter she made with Mengele. But it gave me a whole other perspective, which was not only were there artists like Dina who were able to access stolen materials and paint in a concentration camp, but something that I had not considered, which was that the Nazis sometimes valued artistic talent as a skill. And that skill could sometimes enable an artist to survive. And on top of that, it illuminated to me the fact that not only did these artists exist, this article actually mentioned 2 names, Freddie Hirsch and Dina Gottliebova. And I knew that the United States Holocaust Museum had oral histories of survivors who were willing to tell their testimony. And so now I had a name, or 2 names actually. And so I was able then to start culling the same way I introduced my talk by saying, I like to harvest all this information in detail before I start writing, so I really have a clear sense of that time period. I now knew there were 6 hours of video testimony from an artist's perspective of how she survived the Holocaust because of her artistic skill, and also that she had painted also in such a dark place. So this began a hunt to learn more about our other artists, not just Dina, who worked in the concentration camp. And I decided I was going to write a novel from the perspective of an artist. And now, because of my introduction, you know that that's kind of my thing. I love to look from, the artistic lens because of my mother and my own background. And I was going to write a novel through the perspective of, someone very similar to Dina Gottlieb, who survives and who, is defiant through her painting. So in the meantime, as I'm, culling all this information and, not having written a single sentence yet, but starting to imagine the story that I'm going to write, my agent calls and she said, well, Allison, I'm just checking in to see how you're doing and to see what your next book is going to be. And I said, oh, I have a great idea. And I've actually been researching it for a few months. I'm going to be working on a book about how an artist survives the Holocaust because of her artistic skill. And there is dead silence on the telephone. And I'm like, don't you think it's a great idea? I'm also a middle child, so that's another thing about me. I'm always asking people to tell me I'm great and interesting, and because my parents always were so busy with the other two. So she doesn't respond like I want her to. And I said, it's so interesting, and no one has explored the Holocaust through this time, through this lens. And she said, it sounds very depressing to me, Allison. There's a recession going on. No one's going to want to read that book. I think you should focus on something less esoteric. And my whole heart fell. But as we know in life, so much has to do with timing. And that was a day that I had a babysitter that she called. And so I hung up the phone. I was paying $15 an hour for the babysitter. And I was just told that my idea that I'd been working on for several months didn't seem sellable to my agent. And so I looked at myself in the mirror, and because I did have 2 children under the age of 3, I looked pretty crazy. Like I hadn't had a haircut for months. My hair was like out to here and really curly, and I never did anything for myself because in that one, day that I had a week, I was trying to, work. So I thought, I'm just going to get my hair cut today because this has been a really bad day, and I've just been told it's, my idea is not good. So I went to this little hair salon that's near where I live. That's filled with, lots of people from, different parts of the town, and they have like the helmet you can put your hair in rollers under. And I came in and I just said, could you just take 3 inches off the bottom? I haven't had a haircut in months. And the hairdresser said yes. And I was sitting in the chair, and I was replaying the conversation I had with my agent. And really, like music, and out of the right side of my ear, I heard the stylist next to me telling a story to the person he was cutting the hair of, that someone had been in the other day to his salon who had been at a rehearsal dinner where the bride's grandmother and the groom's grandfather had never met before. And throughout the evening, the groom's grandfather kept on looking very intently at the bride's 80-something-year-old grandmother and kept saying, I know you from somewhere. I know you from somewhere. And she kept on trying to focus on the festivities around her, not on, on her granddaughter, not on this old man. But at the end of the evening, he said, I know this is, very bold of me, but would you roll up your sleeve? And he kept on, saying, just please, please. And eventually she did. And she revealed that she had the 6-number tattoo of Auschwitz on her forearm. And he looked at her, and he looked at the number, and he looked at her again. And he said, you were my wife. So I was like, what? Here I can write a whole book around just one question in my head, which was, could an artist survive the Holocaust? But hearing this story, my mind was sort of exploding with questions. Why did they get separated? Why, what was their initial love story? What was their second love story? Because they had thought each other dead and had gone on to marry other people. But more importantly, my mind thought, how does one survive after such, loss if they each thought each other had died? And so those became the questions that sort of propelled what became The Lost Wife, which I think many of you got as a gift, I think, with your support of the St. Louis Assistance League. Those questions about surviving after great darkness, this love story of what happens when 2 people are separated, thinking the other had died. In this case, in the true story, he looked at her number, and they had been married in the camp, and he knew her number, but they were separated on death marches after Auschwitz was liberated, like before the Russians came in. They were on separate death marches, and then told erroneously at the end of the war that the other person had died, and then went on to marry other people. My book, The Lost Wife, I decided to use that story of a couple separated during the war, thinking each other had died, but I still kept true to my initial idea, which was, could an artist survive the Holocaust with her artistic skill? And also, how does one create if everything was taken away from them? So my main character, Lenka, is an artist. And you see the whole war through her perspective. You see her as a mother, a daughter, a sister, a grandmother through different periods of her lifetime. It's a book that explores memory, because it also explores from the male perspective of how someone who has left his beloved behind, how he remembers her and how he tries to cling to the memories of their youth until they're reconnected in this sort of circular composition of the rehearsal wedding. So that book is very special to me also because I spent years actually interviewing Holocaust survivors. I went to Prague. I went to Terezin. I met with artists who were 90 years old who worked in the propaganda department there, and they really shared stories with me about the other artists that they worked with and how they formed their own resistance to use their artwork. And there's also a true life story about a teacher in Terezin who worked with children, giving them scraps of paper, anything she could find, string for collage, a woman by the name of Friedel Dicker Brandeis, I'm sorry, and how she told the student, these young children every day, write your name on the piece of paper, you're a person, write your address where you came from a place better than here. And every day she inspired the children to use their imagination and to inspire sort of a courageous feeling that they were not going to be trapped here. She was considered the first art therapist. So the book is sort of threaded with true life artists, real names of people who worked and that were shared with me from survivors. But truly at its core, it's what I talked about earlier about a life's journey, how someone can emerge out of darkness and still have love in their heart and still see light around them and beauty. And I think that's something that's very close in my own spirit and heart, and which I set out to do with every book. Although all my books are different, at the core, it's trying to highlight something good in the world. And I think that's really perfect for sort of this, community of readers with the Assistance League, because I know you're all so supportive of trying to bring good into the world. And so I feel like it's a good match. And I also love the fact that Jill and I are both wearing pink today. It's kind of funny. So I'm going to transition now into my most recent book, which is The Secret of Clouds. It is my first contemporary book, actually. My 6 other books prior were all historical that took place in different times of war. But this book the inspiration came in a very unexpected manner. But again, by the time I stop talking about it, you'll see that it's also a reflection of my heart. Back in 2016, just before the presidential election, I was sitting with a friend of mine who was a teacher of the 3rd grade. And I've known this she's not young, she's my age, but I've known this woman for several years. Our daughters are in ballet school together. And we were sitting by the pool watching the children frolic, and it was this warm August. And she said that she'd been teaching for 20 years, and every year she began her year with her students by giving the same assignment. And the assignment was that she would pass around a piece of paper and an envelope, and she would ask her students to write a letter to their 18-year-old self. And she would encourage them to write down their hopes and dreams of how they imagined themselves when they were graduating high school as 18-year-olds. And then she told them to fold the letter, put it in the envelope, address it to themselves, and on the back of the envelope, write a letter from the past with a message for the future. And then she collected the letters, and she would put them in a big manila envelope with the date of that they were, in 10 years when they were 18, when they were to graduate high school, she would promise to mail it back to them. And so she said how exciting it had been over the years to, be able to send her students that she'd had, a decade before, these letters, and for them to revisit the way they imagine themselves in their childhood, now as these adults that are at this important threshold, just about to go to college. So when I heard that she did this every year for 20 years, I was amazed. First of all, I was amazed that she could create an assignment that didn't end that day or that week, even that school year. She was creating an assignment that actually didn't see its full fruition for a decade later. And so not only did that amaze me with her dedication and her organization, because imagine, I can't even imagine holding on to that much paper for so many years for every year. But this passion for her students to create something that she knew would touch them when they were finished with their first years of education before going on to college. But the writer in me also was like, 20 years of teaching and doing this assignment. Did anything ever happen with one of the letters, with one of the children? I mean, that's a tremendous amount of students over the year to collect these letters. And my friend's face sort of changed for a moment, and she said there have been a lot of different things that have happened with students and their letters and things. And she said one in particular that I hold very deep in my heart is that my second year as a young teacher, when I was doing this, I was asked by the superintendent to tutor a young student. I'm not going to cry, I promise you, but I get very emotional easily. A young student who was too sick to attend school. She was asked if she would go to his house twice a year to keep him up on his English language arts. And she said, even though this child was too fragile to go to class with the others, she thought it was extremely important that she gave him the same assignment she gave all of her students. And so she asked him to write the letter. And so what happens in The Secret of Clouds with this letter and with this student is all based on fact of what happened with my friend and this young child. She said it was one of the most transformative experiences to be able to tutor a child who, was at home, who didn't have contact with other students. She became not only his lifeline to the outside world, but also his advocate, because at one point she just told his parents that she really felt that it was important for him to come to class. And even in her case, the child had cancer. In the book, The Secret of Clouds, I decided to change that, not just to protect this person's identity, but also because I had always written historical novels in the past. And I was once really lucky enough to have coffee with the author Kristen Hanna. And she had said over coffee that anytime she switched genres, originally she had written romance, then she did commercial, then she went into historical. She always makes sure that when she switched, that there was something that her other readers from the previous genres would appreciate and come aboard for her next journey that she was telling. And so I wanted to make sure there was a historical element in this book. And so I had a babysitter for my son when he was first born, who was from Ukraine. She was originally, when she lived in Kiev over there, she was a neonatal nurse. And she had told me one day over tea that one of the greatest hardships that she kept towards her, or disappointments that she had thinking back to her life in Ukraine, was the fact that the Soviet Union did not tell them when Chernobyl happened in April 1986 that this nuclear accident happened. And so they woke up on that day in April and they were like, it's incredibly sunny. We'd never have weather so warm in the 80s. And they all went and they sunbathed, and the river that went through the river was unseasonably warm too. It gotten warm very quickly and people went bathing. And there was a May Day parade, a few weeks later, and they were all, going out early to be in that parade in their folkloric costumes. And she said, we had no idea the sunshine that we thought was a blessing was actually, we were soaking up radiation. And that radiation would have consequences to people for years to come. And even to this day in Belarus, because the wind carried the radiation in that direction, children were born with all sorts of heart defects and all sorts of cancers and terrible things. And so there was a particular heart ailment that children who were born of women who were of childbearing age when Chernobyl happened were born with. And so my character Yuri is born to a set of parents who were Ukrainian immigrants in the United States. One is Sasha, who is a scientist, and his wife Katya, who is a former Soviet-trained ballerina. So the ballerina is kind of, I love to always have someone who is an artist of some way in my books. My book, The Garden of Letters, has a cellist. My book, The Velvet Hourist, has someone who binds books. So there's always something creative in novels because I love exploring the artistic perspective. And so Katya's being a Soviet-trained ballerina for me was really wonderful, doing the research and speaking with, immigrants who have come to the United States who were in dance, who were either Romanian or Ukrainian or Russian, and learning how different their dance training is than my daughters or when I dance. So, for example, one of the dancers told me that when she was taking lessons from her instructor, that the instructor would take a lighter and light it under her arabesque to say, get your leg higher, or I'm going to burn you. I mean, can you imagine something happening like in today's world? That wouldn't happen. Or that they sometimes found crushed glass in their toe shoes when they were trying out for a particular piece, particular performance, because the competition was so great. So those type of details too come into the play of how I shape the characters, that you learn about not just the immigrant experience of someone who in the 1980s comes from a Soviet Union bloc country like Ukraine, and the heartache of having a child who is frail, but also these historical elements through what their personality is like, how they approach having a very vulnerable child, being new to a country, how transformative the relationship is, not only between teacher and student, but also how a teacher has an impact on a student's parent's life as well. So I always describe the Secret of Clouds as my love letter to teachers everywhere, because what began with sort of this pursuit to want to, and I mentioned the election not to be political, but because I truly at that time period felt so much division and within my community that I didn't want to write a World War II book. I didn't want to write a Civil War book. I wanted to write a book in which there was a universal thread that connected us, that we all have teachers who have shaped our life, who have seen something in us that they wanted to nurture. I have such fond memories of my first grade teacher passing around a piece of paper, and she had a glass jar with blue tempera paint in it. And she went to each of our papers and she put the brush in and she swirled it around and she put a blob of paint in the center. And then she folded it and then put it down and then on our desk and said, now write what you see. And so I wrote a short story about a flying pickle that had magical powers. And when I got my little story back, on the top of a letter, Mrs. Goldberg had written, "You have a gift with words, Allison." And I love to tell that story because it wasn't my mother, it wasn't my father, it was my grandmother who told me I had a gift from words. It was Mrs. Goldberg in the first grade who saw that I had something special. And, I wouldn't be sitting here today if I didn't have other teachers, my sixth grade teacher who said, "Allison, you need to learn how to use that semicolon because when you're a writer, you're going to need to know." He didn't say if you're a writer, he believed, and get emotional, but those are the people who have belief, who see something, who say, "You're here now, but I expect you to go here." We need them in our lives. We need them in our children's lives. Cry. I think The Secret of Clouds is a very different book than The Lost Wife in the sense that it takes place in the 1990s. It's a very intimate story between a teacher and a student on how she learned so much from him and he learned so much from her. But at its core, like my other books, there's a lot of heart in it, and there's a message about the good that we all have inside of us, and this deep sense of finding our legacy, how we want to leave a fingerprint of our work and our vision behind. And I know you're all like that, supporting the Assistance League, that you have that in your soul. And so I'm appreciative, and I hope you enjoyed my talk. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Allison, it was such a delight hearing what makes you the author you are and what goes into the fascinating novels that you write. I have explored so many of your articles, your videos, and now your presentation, and it is no wonder that you are so highly regarded. We have compiled a few questions from our members that we would love to ask you, if that's okay. Our first question is from Lynn, and she wants to know how you come up with the ideas for your books. For instance, how did you come up to research the information for the Velvet Hours.
Okay. So every one of my books began when I had a question about something, whether it's something that somebody said or something I read or, just came to me, but it comes from this sort of intellectual pursuit to find the answer for whatever question that is. And so with the Velvet Hours, that book is about a apartment in France that was discovered, I think in 2010, I think, that had been shuttered mysteriously for 70 years. And when the heirs, when the owner of this apartment died, she left in her will notification to the heirs that this apartment existed. And when they opened it up, it was like a time capsule to the Belle Epoque in Paris, the turn of the century. It was filled with art and antiques, but most mystifying was that it had a portrait of their grandmother that was done by the famous portrait painter Boldini. And the painting was her in this beautiful dress in a sort of a provocative pose. And there were love letters discovered in the vanity of the apartment from not only Boldini, but from other men. And the article had all these pictures of the apartment that, with its cobwebs over the artwork and the antiques. And immediately as a novelist, I thought, well, why did she not tell her grandchildren about this apartment? And who was this woman, Martha de Florian? And how did she come to be painted by Boldini? And why is this all a secret? And what happened to her during the war? So all of those questions kind of propelled me to create what became the Velvet Hours. And, at the time I wrote the novel, there was very scant information about who Martha de Florian was. We knew that she was a courtesan, that she had had several affairs, and that Boldini too was in love with her. The painting was sold for over $2 million closer to $3 million, I think, eventually by the heirs. But those were the original questions, and because there were these photographs, and you can go online and you can put Martha de Florian's name in it. It just seemed ripe for investigation and writing a beautiful novel about her.
Obviously, this has been a very challenging year for everyone. Another one of our members would like to know, Allison, if it changed your writing process, or did it even change you as a writer?
That's a really good question. Well, it changed my writing process because actually I was less busy than I normally am. I normally have a pretty full schedule of traveling and doing speaking engagements and do them with my writing. And also, my son has just learned to drive a few weeks ago. He got his license. So I was always responsible for driving both my son and my daughter to all their activities. So by 2:30, my day ended. And my weekends also were filled with all, baseball games and orchestra. With COVID and I wasn't going anywhere, I really accelerated my pacing of my novel writing. So I've been working on two projects with, they're group projects. I have one book that's going to come out in 2022 that's with two other authors. And so we all working together. And then another one that I'm co-authoring with a friend of mine about the Civil War. And so what was nice is that I wasn't alone. We were working on these projects, but I also was working on them, from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., sometimes 5 p.m., much longer workday. And then I always worked on the weekend. So I've never worked harder, but I also chose to work with people so I wasn't so completely inside my head. But it's amazing how much you get done if you're not going anywhere. So it's just that's very true. Feeding my children all the time. Everyone seemed hungry perpetually, so I had to.
Mine too.
There's refrigerator. I will make dinner, but breakfast and lunch you're going to have to.
Yeah, you're on your own.
But that was it.
Okay. Marilyn would like to know why you think some books are selected either for made for TV or motion pictures. And is there anything you can tell us about the progress of The Lost Wife, which is in production for a motion picture? I know that there are probably some things you can't reveal to us right now, but is there anything you can tell us?
I can reveal that the script is written and the script is really good, which is, I think, the hardest thing for the author to sort of let go of if you're not writing the script yourself, of whether the story is captured well. And the script is really beautiful. And they haven't.
Did they follow the book?
They did, for the most part, they followed the book. Certainly the essence of the book. The beginning is a little different at this point, so I don't know how, if once they cement the director, he will interpret more from how I begin the book. But from what I've learned in film telling, or instead of storytelling, is that you don't want to give the ending away in the beginning. And my book begins at the end. So that was the only thing that wasn't exactly the same, but everything else was done beautifully, really. I mean, really artistically. But, it takes tens of millions of dollars to make a movie. So, we just have to make sure it gets set up in the right way so that there's the finance behind it. But the script is wonderful. They have an actress and an actor who want to play Joseph and Lenka. I can't say who, but that's done. But there's so many stages. I mean, it's not first it's option, then it goes into development where there's a script and it's sent around to the talent. But then the production part is like getting the money to get it off the ground. So we have to just keep our fingers crossed for that.
Oh, good.
And then to answer your question of why are certain books chosen and others aren't, I mean, truthfully, I've had 3 books optioned for film, but The Lost Wife is the only one that got into the development stage where actually someone paid money for a script to be made, and then it got to be sending around to talent. Before, it was just producers saying, this would make a beautiful movie, but it didn't go further than that.
Our next question is that you have mentioned your time in Japan was very influential. And I've read some things that you've talked about with it. We would just love to kind of hear your experience and some of the things that influenced you.
Yeah. So when I was 15 years old, my father was transferred to Japan, to Tokyo, to work. He's in the semiconductor business, and he was starting up a subsidiary semiconductor business between an American company and a Japanese company. So I was actually slated to go to boarding school that year, and my father was like, I think you should defer it, and I think you should come with the family. It's going to be an amazing experience. And I really didn't want to, but I did do what my parents wanted me to do at the end. So my junior year, I decided that I'd go back to Japan because I wanted to really become fluent in Japanese. And I went through Stanford University with their program at Kyoto University. It was a you had a homestay program, and then you also took language and culture classes during the day at the university. But all this makes sense because of my introduction. My mother always said to really understand another culture too, you have to study their traditional arts. And I had always been fascinated with no theater in Japan. It's like a slower form of kabuki. It's not as sort of, it would be like Broadway. No would be like going to a poetry reading. But they use these wooden masks, and it's an all-male cast. But even when they perform female characters, when they wear that mask, they spiritually believe they're becoming that character. Oh, wow. And so I wanted to make the mask. So I wrote to someone who knew of what's called a national treasure, someone who specializes in these ancient Japanese art forms, and to see if I could become a student of his. He was in his 80s. He lived, at the base of a mountain in a little tatami house making these masks for the No Theater. So for a year, I worked on one mask. It took me 9 months to carve one mask, no sandpaper.
Oh my goodness.
You have to take a block of cypress wood, use chisels. You're looking at an ancient mask and just looking and trying to recreate it with only your eyes. There's no patterns, nothing, no guidance. And then you ground the materials for the paint. So it's a very, very, laborious process. But it's also considered very spiritual because the Japanese no mask carver believes that he's infusing the spirit of the mask into the wood, and when the actor puts it on and ties it around his face, he releases it onto the stage. So all of this to me was so interesting to learn. But I had my first epiphany, I guess, when I was carving in this little tatami room how old was I? 20 years old, where I thought, here I am, this Western woman studying a traditional Japanese art form, and there are 3 Japanese apprentices around me. When did the reverse occur? When did the first Japanese start studying European art? And I knew from my art history classes that so many of the Impressionist painters like Monet and even, Degas were influenced by what we call Orientalism or Japonisme. I don't know if it's PC anymore to say Orientalism, but what was coming in from the East into Paris during that time period. But no one had ever looked, well, how were the Japanese influenced by the Europeans? And so when I came back to Wellesley and I was going to be a senior that year and having to prepare a thesis for my art history major, I started to ask my professors, like, well, has anything been written on from the Japanese perspective of what it was like to be in the turn of the century? And did any of them come to travel to Paris to study? And no one knew of anything that had been written. So they encouraged me to apply for a grant to research that. And so I did.
Oh, wow.
I got the grant. It was through IBM, it's the Thomas J. Watson Fellowship. They give 60 students a year. To this day, they still do it, who are interested in pursuing something that is global and international and usually esoteric. I think I got $25,000, which in 1994 was a lot of money.
It was a lot of money back
Yeah,
then.
and all they said was go for it. You've proven to be a good student. If this is what you want to research it and somehow use it to contribute it into the world someday. And I decided I was going to write a novel, and I was going to write in the perspective of a Japanese man who's a young man, and son of a Japanese no-mask carver, during a period in Japan when Japan is just opening up to the West because it had an isolationist policy before then that no one could travel outside of the island.
Crystal, another one of our members, would like to know if there are any favorite books that you've read during this quarantine time.
Oh, thank you for asking that, because I have read quite a few wonderful books. The book I'm going to recommend with all my heart is The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab is her name. And it is a beautiful, beautiful book. It really got me through quarantine. I don't want to give too much of the storyline away, but I will say that I read an interview with the author where she said that the idea for the book came about after she lost her grandmother, who was French, and she went to pack away some of her things in her little country home in a French village. And she thought about how sad she was to lose her grandmother. And then her mind went to think how the saddest thing when someone dies is if they're not remembered. And she creates a character in her book about a young French woman in the 18th century who's forced to marry someone she doesn't love. And, on the day of her marriage, she runs into the woods and meets a dark spirit who says, well, I will grant you immortality and you don't have to marry this person today, but for the rest of eternity, once you leave a room, you won't be remembered. And what that does to the character,
oh my goodness,
not to be remembered. It's brilliant. I mean, it really, I read this book and I thought, I don't know if I'm qualified to be a writer. This is so brilliant.
Oh. All right, next question. In February of 2020, you visited Vietnam for research on your next book. Can you tell us about your journey and actually how you came up with this idea?
So that's my standalone book. At this point, it's entitled The Minute's Home. Hopefully that'll be out in a couple of years. So that book is inspired by also a true life story on Long Island about someone who, in the late 1970s, an Irish immigrant on Long Island, whose life becomes entwined with a Vietnamese family that's comprised of both children, who were sponsored by the Catholic Church after the Vietnam War. And I was really inspired by this story because of the good that this woman had done to sort of help this family assimilate into American life, to help with literacy and just general acclamation. But because my mind also is always trying to switch perspective of just, so that my stories aren't, I don't want to say one-dimensional, but there's just not one storyline.
Right.
I wanted to also create a story in which you also have the perspective of a Vietnam veteran who's coming back from that time period in the same town. And so there's two storylines. There's a Vietnam veteran who's suffered tremendously from the trauma of the war, but also this young Vietnamese, aunt and child, not the mother, because something has happened with the parents, but how they each heal through unexpected friendship as they all come together. So I went to Vietnam for research for that book. I got back February 9th, and as I had to fly, I went with my mother. When we were transferring from Saigon to Hong Kong, New York, people were already in hazmat suits,
oh my goodness,
there were all sorts of things, and people that we knew, because I went through and my father went to MIT, and so it was a very small boat that went down the river in the south of Vietnam, so I could see where a lot of the villages were, and there were academics on the trip. A lot of their planes who were flying American had been canceled while we were away, because it was like a 21-day trip or something like that. So it was very dramatic. I feel like we were one of the last people who got back, before things were. I was flying out the Pacific, but thank God I got the research done, because I do have to see everything to paint that for you. And I have to understand, meeting with Vietnamese people, learning about the culture, making sure I'm doing my due diligence is so important to tell a story with great sensitivity. So hopefully that one will be out in 2023.
Well, we can't wait to have it come out.
Thank you.
Your books would not be classified as romance novels, although there's such loving relationships in each of your books. Mary would like to know how you weave this love in so beautifully in all of the stories that you've written.
Oh, thank you for phrasing it like that, because it's I think people ask me that, like, well, you don't write romance stories, but there's always a love story somehow, typically. I mean, there isn't actually in my first book, The Mask of Carver's Son, there isn't a very concrete love story. But I think as I've gotten older as a novelist, what I've become particularly fascinated with is how in a lifetime, there are all these different shades of love, like, for example, in The Lost Wife, the initial love story of these people who are separated at the war, it has all the facets of first love and that passion and that newness. It does. But the second love stories actually are almost more interesting, these shades of gray of when people have come together out of great loss and suffering and life experience, and how they still forge some sort of love, how they have a family after great darkness, how they have love with their children and their parents and their sisters, all these different things. Like, for me, that's very fascinating as a writer, to explore and to force myself to look around and see, well, where do I see love in my daily life? How do I see my parents as older people experiencing love? How do I see it in my own marriage now that I'm a mother and I don't have as much time to brush my hair and be like I was when I was 20 something? So the growth of love, the evolution of love, to me is what propels how I write about love. It's not, the heat of love doesn't intrigue me. It's the poetry of love.
Deeper.
Yeah, it's deeper.
Yeah.
So I try and put that in my book because I think it's important. And I think if a book is successful, and I mean successful in the sense that people relate to it and want to recommend it to others, it has to have some truth in it. So, it has a lot of truth, actually. So the truth is, does that feel like true? Like, does that feel like an honest portrayal of what love is? Is it something, you want to connect with the reader. You want them to think, when I read The Lost Wife and I see her relationship with her sister, I can imagine that being my sister. I can imagine wanting to do that because it's my child or my mother, and having that universal connection. Even if you're from Botswana and you're reading The Lost Wife, that's what's so amazing for me to have these international translations. It's that a book written in English about a Jewish family during World War II could be read in a different country and still be powerful and relevant. So that to me is something that gives me great joy.
You are such a, we just said this before, but you're such a heartfelt writer, but you're also a very accomplished artist. Chris would like to know what led you in the direction of writing over painting, or do you maybe do as much painting as writing? Or
Well, I always wanted to be a painter, actually. As much as I've always been writing, and like how I just described my first grade teacher saying that I had a gift from words, I always would say, well, I want to be a writer and an illustrator, and I always draw at the same time.
I want it all.
I want it all. I would always say that when people say, what did you want to be when you grow up? I remember my fourth grade teacher saying, and I said, well, I want to write stories, but I also want to draw the pictures that go with them. I wasn't sophisticated enough to know that there was a difference between children's authors and novelists. But my mother actually was the one who was always say like, well, I think you make a better living being a writer than a how difficult.
Moms are thinking very down the line.
And she said it's so hard to make a living being an artist. And I mean, I don't think she realized how hard it is to make a living being a novelist, but she would always say, I think it's more practical. Like if you did something with your writing, you're such a good writing and you can always paint. But when I applied for college, actually, I applied to almost exclusively art programs. Like I applied to Cornell School of Art and Architecture, Carnegie Mellon School of, Art. And while I was accepted to those colleges, my parents were both like, are you sure at the age of 18, this is exactly what you want to be, whereas Wellesley afforded the opportunity for me to do anything because it was just pure liberal arts. And so they kind of pressured me, like they put all this doubt, like, you sure? And then I don't know. And so I did go to Wellesley thinking I would still major in visual arts, but take other courses. But then I got there and I didn't love the visual arts program as much as I loved the art history program. And then all of my teachers kept on saying, you have such a gift for telling the story behind the painting. You have such a gift for putting in historical context and, rich descriptive language. And I just remember sitting under a tree one day and saying, well, if I could do anything in the world, I just like to write about artists and write novels and invent, but weave in stories and history. And, I'm really lucky that I was sitting underneath the tree thinking that. And then I was so naive that I was like, maybe I could do that instead of.
I could do that.
Yeah. Like I just was like, well, I would like to do that. Maybe I could. And so I applied for this grant thinking like, because my parents were like, you're going to have to get a real job. I mean, they were always very practical. But I applied for this grant, and because I had that paid year to do research and to start writing it, I was really, really lucky. And then I came back and I worked for a year and I started dating my husband, and he, because he was working, like reading my manuscript, he was like, you know what, take a year and see if you can get an agent. And so I was 25 and I did that. I got an agent, and then the book came out when I was 26. And I think I got an agent at 24, actually, because I know I had to tweak it a little bit.
Well, we have come to the end of our questions. Allison, I just want to thank you so much for being with us this morning. Our theme, Living with a Full Heart, it resonates even more after listening to you talk. Okay. Being a retired teacher myself, there are things I would love to have done with my students after reading the book, like the letter, to the 18-year-old self. I think I might do that with my grandkids, actually, because it's just such an incredibly neat idea. Yeah. I want to thank you, too, for signing all of the book plates, making the copies that our members got even more special. And we do still have a few copies of both The Lost Wife and The Secret of Clouds at headquarters, if anyone would like to purchase one. And before you leave, Allison, I do want you to know that we designed several of your opportunity baskets around the themes of your books, which makes them even more unique. Mm-hmm. And we did put a copy of that themed book included in each of those baskets. Mm-hmm. So again, Allison, this has been such a treat for me. I've looked forward to meeting you for so incredibly long. And I just want to thank you for being with us. I know our members will love hearing you speak, and I just thank you so much for being with us.
It's my pleasure, and I hope I have a chance to meet all of you in person sometime in the future when another book comes out. So thank you, and thank you for.
I sure hope so too. Thanks for being with us, Allison.
Thank you.
Now, on to the winners of our opportunity baskets. Before we begin, I have to give a huge thank you to Rich Mers. He came to headquarters several times and photographed each basket and then made gorgeous posters for all of our members to see. I hope you were able to see them. An enormous thank you to my incredible basket committee and all who donated to make them so appealing. Let's start with our first basket. The title of this one is The Mask Carver's Son, which includes our ever-popular $300 money tree. And the winner is Harriet Young. Our second basket is The Velvet Hours, and the winner is Debbie Weiss. Congratulations, Debbie. The next basket is The Last Van Gogh, and the winner of this beautiful basket is Carolyn Dorr. Congratulations, Carolyn. The Garden of Letters is our next basket, and the winner is Yolanda Perez Cunningham. Congratulations, Yolanda. For our next basket, the theme is The Secret of Clouds, and the winner is Allison Richmond. And last, but certainly not least, is our wine and bourbon basket, and the lucky winner is Joyce Glazer. Congratulations to all of our winners. You may pick up your basket at headquarters on Monday, April 26th from 1 to 2:30, or contact Judith Mitchell to make other arrangements. I have to mention the basket committee just one more time. They were so creative and organized, and it certainly does show in these beautiful baskets. There are so many people who made this event possible. I first want to thank HEC Productions for all they have done for putting this together so effortlessly. This virtual presentation would not have happened without their expertise. You know, It Takes a Village comes to mind, and to all my committee members and the Finance Committee, a very heartfelt thank you. You all worked so hard at putting all of the pieces of this puzzle together to make it so great. And Dawn Thomas, Yolanda Perez Cunningham, and Connie Curran, this would not have been possible without the leadership that each one of you brought to this event. Thank you for being you. If you have friends who missed this production, or you would just like to see it again, it will be archived shortly by HEC. Just go to hecmedia.org or our website at alstl.org. Thanks so much for being with us, everyone. I hope that you all had fun. I know some of you had little parties going on, and I hope now that you have a new favorite author. Bye for now.